Arizona Territory, November 1878. The iron cage sat in the center of Copper Springs like a monument to cruelty. 4 feet by 4 feet, barely large enough for a dog. Inside, a woman named Naichi had been locked away for 5 days. Her crime? Being Apache, being poor, being alone in a territory that had no place for people like her. The desert sun had baked her skin during the day, temperatures climbing past 100 degrees. At night, the cold had cut through her thin dress, dropping to 40 degrees while she shivered against iron bars that had long since stopped feeling cold. Everything had stopped feeling. Her lips were cracked and bleeding. Her tongue was thick in her mouth. The townspeople walked past her like she was already a corpse. Some threw stones. Children threw snowballs packed with dirt and rocks, laughing when they hit her face. Women pulled their skirts away as they passed, as if poverty and brown skin were diseases that could spread through the air. Men spat tobacco juice at her feet and called her animal, savage, filth that had blown in from somewhere else and needed to be swept away. Naichi had stopped crying on the 3rd day. The tears had frozen on her cheeks during one of those brutal nights, and she had learned that tears changed nothing. The cage remained, the cold remained, the hatred remained. She had curled into herself, knees pulled to her chest, spine curved against bars that pressed into her flesh, and she had waited. For death, perhaps. For mercy, though she had stopped believing in that long ago. For anything other than this slow dissolution of everything she had once been. She was Apache, Chiricahua Apache, 24 years old, though she felt 100. 2 years ago, she had been a daughter, a sister, part of a family that had lived in careful peace on land that had been promised to them. Then the soldiers had come. Not because her family had done anything wrong, but because someone, somewhere, had decided that peaceful Apaches and hostile Apaches looked exactly the same through a rifle scope. They had killed her father first, then her 2 brothers. Her mother had died 3 months later from a fever, though Naichi knew it was really from a broken heart. And Naichi, young and alone and grieving, had been sold. The paperwork said indentured labor. The law said it was legal. But Naichi knew slavery when she was living it. Cornelius Blackwood had bought her contract. He owned silver mines across the territory. He also owned saloons, brothels, businesses built on the backs of Apache labor that he purchased for pennies and worked until they broke. For 2 years, Naichi had survived in his establishment in Tucson. Survived is the only word that fits. She had learned to make her mind go somewhere else when men paid for her time. She had learned to hide the hatred in her eyes when Jacob Blackwood, Cornelius's younger brother, had inspected her like livestock. Jacob was the enforcer, the hunter, the man who tracked down anyone foolish enough to run. Naichi had tried once, 14 months into her captivity. She had made it almost 30 miles before Jacob had found her. He had brought her back tied to his saddle like a dead deer. Then he had used a bullwhip on her back to ensure she remembered what happened to property that tried to escape. But 6 months ago, Naichi had tried again. This time she had been smarter. She had stolen food, a canteen, a knife. She had headed into the desert where Jacob's tracking skills meant less than her knowledge of how to survive on nothing. For 6 months she had been free, living in caves, eating roots and lizards, and whatever she could catch or find. 6 months of freedom that had felt like flying after 2 years in a cage. Then she had made a mistake. She had come to Copper Springs looking for work, any work, just enough to buy supplies and keep moving west. She had walked into the mercantile and asked if they needed help sweeping floors or washing windows. The owner had taken one look at her worn dress, her Apache features, her empty pockets, and had called for the sheriff. Sheriff Wade Decker had recognized her from the wanted posters Cornelius Blackwood circulated. Escaped property, Apache woman, 24, scar on her left shoulder blade from a whip. Return for $20 reward. Decker had not bothered with questions or trials or anything resembling justice. He had simply locked her in this cage in the town square and sent word to Tucson that he had found Blackwood's missing merchandise. That had been 5 days ago. 5 days of sun and cold and thirst and the casual cruelty of people who saw her suffering and felt nothing. A woman had walked by yesterday with fresh bread in a basket. Nietzsche had whispered, "Please, just a crust, just anything." The woman had walked faster, clutching her basket tighter, and had not looked back. Nietzsche was drifting between consciousness and something darker when she heard the wagon. At first, she did not look up. Wagons came through Copper Springs regularly. None of them ever stopped for her. But then she heard something different. Children's voices, high and bright, cutting through the November air like bells. "Papa, look at that! Papa, there's a lady! Papa, why is that lady in a cage?" Nietzsche lifted her head. Her vision was blurry from dehydration and exhaustion, but she could make out the wagon that had stopped about 20 feet from her cage. A man was climbing down from the driver's seat. Tall, broad-shouldered, long hair and a beard so thick he looked more bear than man. His clothes were buckskin and fur, the kind worn by men who lived in the mountains and came to town maybe twice a year. In the back of the wagon sat 5 little girls. The oldest looked maybe 13, dark-haired and serious. The youngest could not have been more than 4, with black braids and eyes that were too wide, too innocent for the world she was looking at. They all stared at Nietzsche through the bars with a mixture of confusion and concern that Nietzsche had not seen in 5 days. The man walked toward the cage. His boots crunched on the frozen ground. When he got close enough, he crouched down so he was at eye level with Nietzsche. For the first time in 5 days, someone actually looked at her, really looked at her. Not through her, not past her, but directly at her, like she was a human being worth seeing. His eyes were blue, tired and sad, but there was something else in them too, something that looked like the kind of anger that burns cold and steady, rather than hot and quick. "How long?" he asked. His voice was quiet, rough, the voice of a man who did not waste words. Nietzsche tried to speak, but her throat was too dry. She swallowed hard, tasting blood, and tried again. 5 days. His jaw tightened. A muscle jumped in his cheek. "They give you water?" "Yesterday morning. A cup." "Food?" Nietzsche shook her head. Something dark flickered across his face. He stood and turned toward the land office where Sheriff Decker was leaning against a post, watching them with the kind of cold amusement men get when they have power and enjoy using it. "This your doing?" the mountain man called. His voice carried across the square. "Sure is," Decker said. He pushed off the post and walked closer, thumbs hooked in his belt. "I heard you bought the Pritchard place out on Miller's Creek. Ezra Coleman, right? Welcome to Copper Springs." Coleman. So that was his name. Ezra Coleman. "I see you've met our local attraction," Decker continued, gesturing at Nietzsche like she was a circus animal. "Vagrant trash. Caught her begging 3 days back." "This is how we handle her kind around here. By locking them in a cage to freeze to death?" Ezra asked. By teaching them a lesson, Decker said. His smile had teeth. You got a problem with that, Coleman? I do. Then I suggest you mind your business and move along. Your kind's welcome in Dust Creek. Hers ain't. For a long moment, the two men stared at each other. Naichi could see the tension coiling between them, like a snake preparing to strike. Then Ezra reached into his coat and pulled out a handful of bills. How much to let her out? He asked. Decker blinked. What? The woman. How much to open that cage and let her walk? She ain't for sale. Everything's for sale. Name your price. Decker laughed, an ugly sound that had nothing to do with humor. You want to buy yourself a vagrant, Coleman? What, your 5 girls ain't enough to warm your bed? Ezra moved so fast, Naichi barely saw it. One moment he was standing 3 feet from Decker. The next, he had the sheriff pinned against the land office wall, his forearm pressed against Decker's throat, hard enough to cut off air. Watch your mouth, Ezra said quietly. Those are my daughters you're talking about. Decker's face was turning red. His hands clawed at Ezra's arm, but the mountain man did not budge. Get off me, Decker choked out. Name your price, Ezra said, right now, or I break your neck right here in front of your whole town. The crowd that had been watching from a distance suddenly went very still. Naichi could feel the attention shift, the weight of it pressing down on this moment. This was not how things were supposed to go in Copper Springs. Men like Ezra Coleman were not supposed to threaten men like Sheriff Decker over something as worthless as an Apache woman in a cage. $50, Decker gasped. 50, and she's yours. Ezra let him go. Decker stumbled forward, gasping for air, his hand going to his throat where red marks were already forming. You're crazy, he spat. Crazy as a kicked dog. Ezra pulled money from his pocket and counted out the bills without looking at Decker. He held them toward the sheriff. Open the cage, he said. You're making a mistake. I said open it. Decker's face twisted with fury, but he pulled a key ring from his belt and stomped toward the cage. He jammed the key into the padlock with more force than necessary and yanked it open. Fine, he said. Take her. But when she robs you blind or runs off with your silverware, don't come crying to me. Naichi tried to move. Her body had other ideas. 5 days folded into that cramped space had left her muscles useless, her joints locked, her limbs refusing to obey simple commands. She managed to shift forward a few inches, but when she tried to stand, everything gave out. Her legs buckled. Her vision went gray. Ezra caught her before she hit the ground. His arms swept her up like she weighed nothing, one arm under her back, the other under her knees. He held her against his chest, and for the first time in 5 days, Naichi felt warmth, real warmth, radiating from this stranger who had just paid $50 for a woman he had never met. I've got you, he said quietly. You're safe now. Naichi wanted to respond, wanted to thank him, question him, understand what was happening, but her throat closed up, and all that came out was a sound that might have been a sob or might have been something breaking loose inside her chest. Ezra carried her to the wagon. The 5 girls scooted back to make room, their eyes wide and worried. The oldest one, the dark-haired girl who had been watching everything with the kind of seriousness that comes from growing up too fast, immediately reached for blankets. "Papa, she's freezing," the girl said. "I know, Grace. Cover her up." The girls moved with practiced efficiency. Blankets appeared, tucked around Naichi's shaking body. The second oldest, a girl with watchful eyes and a suspicious expression, helped arrange them. The youngest one, the child with the braids, pressed against Naichi's side and whispered, "Don't be scared. Papa's going to take care of you." Ezra climbed into the driver's seat and gathered the reins. "Wait just a minute," Decker started. His voice had recovered some of its authority, or at least was trying to. "We're done here," Ezra said. He did not turn around. "You came for fence posts and feed, Coleman, not some vagrant." "I changed my mind." Ezra snapped the reins, and the wagon lurched forward. As they rolled out of Copper Springs, Naichi looked back through the blankets and saw Sheriff Decker still standing by the empty cage, his face twisted with something between rage and confusion and the slowly dawning realization that he had just sold a human being like livestock and would have to explain that to Cornelius Blackwood. Naichi did not care anymore. For the first time in 5 days, she was free. For the first time in 2 years, someone had looked at her and seen a person worth saving. The wagon rolled west along a road that cut through snow-covered prairie, and Naichi let the darkness take her, knowing that when she woke up, she would not be in a cage. The wagon rolled through terrain that climbed steadily upward, leaving the flat desert behind for something greener, colder, more alive. Naichi drifted in and out of consciousness, aware only of the blankets around her, the warmth of small bodies pressed close, and the rhythmic creak of wagon wheels on frozen ground. Voices floated around her like birds, the 5 girls talking in whispers that rose and fell with the music of childhood. "I'm Grace," the oldest one said at some point. "That's Pearl. That's Ruth and Clara. And you already met Fawn." Naichi tried to smile, but her face was too frozen, too damaged by 5 days of exposure. The best she could manage was a small nod that took more energy than it should have. "Here," another voice said. "Pearl, maybe. Drink slow. Papa says if you drink too fast when you're real thirsty, it makes you sick." Cool water touched Naichi's lips. Not cold, but not warm either. Just perfect. She took small sips, feeling it spread through her body like life itself returning to dried channels. Each swallow was a small miracle, each breath a little easier than the one before. "What's your name?" one of the younger girls asked. Ruth, perhaps, with pale hair and watchful eyes. Naichi managed to whisper it, her own name, spoken for the first time in 5 days to someone who actually cared to know it. "That's pretty," the little one said. "Fawn. You smell like snow." "Fawn," the older girl hissed. "Don't say things like that." "Why not? Snow smells nice." Something cracked open in Naichi's chest. These girls, with their bright eyes and easy kindness, had no idea what they were doing to her. No idea that 5 days ago she had given up hope of ever being treated like a human being again. No idea that their simple acceptance was rebuilding something inside her that she had thought was permanently broken. "It's all right," Naichi whispered. "I don't mind." Ezra's voice carried from the front of the wagon, rough and warm at the same time. "How are you doing back there, Miss Naichi?" Miss. He had called her Miss, like she was someone worth respecting, like she was a person instead of property. "Better," Naichi said. "Thank you for what you did back there." "Don't thank me yet. We've got 3 hours of riding ahead, and I can't guarantee the girls won't talk your ear off." "Papa," Pearl protested, "we're being helpful." "I know you are, sweetheart." Naichi pulled the blankets tighter and watched the landscape roll by. The desert was giving way to pine trees now, the air growing thinner and colder as they climbed. Mountains rose ahead of them, massive and ancient, their peaks already white with early winter snow. Somewhere up there, Ezra Coleman had a home. Somewhere up there, Naichi might find safety, at least for a while. "Can I ask you something?" Nietzsche did not know why she was talking. Maybe because silence felt too heavy. Maybe because she needed to understand what was happening before her mind accepted it as real. "Go ahead," Ezra said. "Why did you stop? Everyone else just walked past. Why you?" Ezra was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was rougher than before, like something in his throat had tightened. "Because my wife would have stopped. And even though she's been gone 3 years, I still try to do what she would have done. I'm sorry about your wife." "Me too." He glanced back at his daughters. "But she left me these 5, and that's more than most men get. I just try to raise them the way she would have wanted." The youngest girl, Fawn, tugged on Nietzsche's sleeve. "Ma's in heaven," she whispered, "but she watches us from the stars." "That's beautiful," Nietzsche whispered back. "Papa told us. He says she's the brightest one, right up there next to the moon." Nietzsche looked at these 5 motherless girls, clustered around a stranger they had found in a cage, offering warmth and water and kindness, like it was the most natural thing in the world. She thought about the woman who had raised them, the woman who was apparently so full of light that even 3 years after her death, her family still tried to live by her example. "She must have been an amazing woman," Nietzsche said. "She was," Ezra agreed. "The best I ever knew." They rode in silence after that. Nietzsche drifted in and out of sleep, her body finally relaxing now that it was not fighting for survival. Every time she woke, one of the girls would be watching her with concerned eyes, ready to offer water or adjust blankets. At some point, Grace started humming, a hymn maybe, something soft and slow that made Nietzsche think of churches and Sunday mornings and a life she had left behind years ago. When the wagon finally stopped, the sun was touching the western mountains, turning them gold and purple. "We're home," Fawn announced. "Can Miss Nietzsche sleep in my room?" "She's going to have her own room, sweetheart," Ezra said. "The spare bedroom. But I want her close." "She'll be close enough. Now everybody out. Let's get Miss Nietzsche inside." The girls scrambled down from the wagon like they had done this 1,000 times before. Ezra came around to the back and held out his arms. "Can you walk?" Nietzsche tried to move her legs. They responded, barely. "I think so. Maybe." "Let me help." He lifted her down from the wagon, his hands gentle but strong, supporting without constraining. "Easy," he murmured. "Take your time." Nietzsche took a step, then another. Her legs felt like they belonged to someone else, but they held. The cabin was modest but solid, logs and stone, with a wide front porch and smoke curling from the chimney. The girls ran ahead, throwing open the door and calling out about the guest they had brought home. "This way," Ezra said. His hand stayed on her elbow. "Watch the step." Inside, the cabin smelled like wood smoke and something cooking. Venison stew, Nietzsche's empty stomach told her, cramping at the scent. The main room was larger than she expected, with a stone fireplace and furniture that looked handmade but sturdy. Things hung on the walls, woven pieces and carvings that spoke of Cherokee craftsmanship. Sarah's work, Nietzsche realized. The ghost of the woman who had made this house a home. "Girls," Ezra called. "Pearl, get bowls on the table. Grace, fetch clean clothes from your mother's trunk. Ruth, help your sisters. Clara, Fawn, stay out of the way." They scattered to their tasks like a well-trained army. Ezra guided Nietzsche to a chair by the fire and helped her sit. The heat was almost painful after so much cold, but she did not pull away, could not pull away. The warmth was the first good thing she had felt in longer than she could remember. "I don't understand," she said quietly. "Any of this. Why you paid for me. Why you brought me here." She looked up at him. "I'm nobody, Mr. Coleman. I've got nothing. No money, no family, nothing to offer you. Why would you do this?" "Because someone should have," Ezra said. His voice was firm, certain. "Someone should have stopped that cage 5 days ago, and no one did. I couldn't change that, but I could change what happened next. You don't even know me. I know you were cold and hungry and treated like an animal by people who call themselves Christians." His eyes held hers. "I know that's wrong. That's enough for now." Grace appeared with a bundle of clothes. "These were Mama's," she said. "They might be a little big, but they're clean." Naichi took the clothes with trembling hands. "Thank you. I'll take good care of them." "They're yours now," Grace said. "Mama would have wanted you to have them." Before Naichi could respond, Pearl appeared with a steaming bowl. "Stew's ready. Eat slow, though. You haven't had food in a while." Naichi took the bowl and just held it for a moment, letting the warmth seep through the ceramic into her frozen fingers. The smell made her dizzy with hunger, made her realize just how close to the edge she had been. She took one bite, then another. It was the best thing she had ever tasted, rich and savory and real. "Good?" Ruth asked, hovering nearby. "So good," Naichi said. Her voice cracked. "So very good." She ate slowly, the way Pearl had advised, while the girls bustled around, preparing beds and heating water. Ezra sat in a chair across the room, watching everything with those tired, sad eyes that still held that core of something stronger. When Naichi finally set down the empty bowl, she felt almost human again. "There's a bedroom at the end of the hall," Ezra said. "It's small, but it's private. You can stay there as long as you need." "I can't just," Naichi started. "I mean, I should work, earn my keep." "We'll talk about that tomorrow. Tonight, you rest." He stood and nodded to Grace. "Help Miss Naichi to her room. Make sure she has everything she needs." "Yes, Papa." Grace led Naichi down a narrow hallway to a small room at the back of the house. There was a bed with a thick quilt, a washstand with a basin, and a window that looked out over the eastern pasture where the first stars were beginning to appear. "The water's warm," Grace said, gesturing to the basin. "And I left clean towels on the bed. Is there anything else you need?" Naichi looked around the room that was somehow hers, private, safe, warm. "I don't know how to thank you," she whispered. "Any of you." "You don't have to," Grace said. She smiled, and for a moment she looked exactly like Naichi imagined her mother must have looked. "Mama always said, kindness isn't something you pay back. It's something you pass forward." She left, closing the door softly behind her. Naichi stood alone in the room, feeling the weight of everything that had happened pressing down on her. She wanted to cry, wanted to scream, wanted to fall to her knees and thank God, or curse him or something, anything to release the pressure building in her chest. Instead, she walked to the basin and looked at her reflection in the small mirror above it. The face that stared back was barely recognizable. Gaunt cheeks, cracked lips, eyes that looked 100 years old. But she was alive. Against all odds, against everything that had tried to destroy her, she was alive. Naichi washed her face with the warm water, scrubbing away 5 days of dirt and tears and despair. She changed into Sarah Coleman's clothes, a simple dress that was indeed too big, but felt like the finest silk against her damaged skin. Then she crawled into the bed, pulled the quilt up to her chin, and listened to the sounds of the house settling around her. Children's voices, soft and cheerful. Ezra's low murmur answering questions. The crackle of the fire. The creak of floorboards. Normal sounds. Family sounds. Sounds Nietzsche had forgotten existed. She closed her eyes and let sleep take her. And for the first time in years, she slept without nightmares. The days that followed fell into a rhythm that felt both strange and natural. Nietzsche woke each morning to the smell of coffee and bacon, to the sound of girls giggling and Ezra's quiet voice organizing the chaos. She helped where she could, learning the rhythms of this household that ran on love and routine in equal measure. Grace taught her how the chores were divided. Pearl showed her where things were kept, still watchful but slowly warming. Ruth sketched pictures of her when she thought Nietzsche was not looking, capturing something in her face that Nietzsche could not see herself. Clara asked endless questions about everything, her curiosity as boundless as the sky. And Fawn simply attached herself to Nietzsche's side like a shadow, chattering in a mix of English and the few Cherokee words her mother had taught her. On the third day, Nietzsche showed them how to make peaky bread, the Apache flatbread her mother had taught her. The girls watched with fascination as she worked, their questions coming faster than she could answer. By the fourth day, she was telling them stories of Coyote, the trickster, tales her grandfather had told her before everything had been taken away. Ezra watched all of this with something in his eyes that Nietzsche could not quite name. Not suspicion, not exactly approval either. Something softer, something that looked like hope, cautiously testing its wings after a long winter. On the eighth day, everything changed. Nietzsche was helping Ezra tan hides behind the cabin, her hands remembering skills she had learned as a child. He worked beside her in comfortable silence, the kind of quiet that exists between people who are learning to trust each other. She was actually smiling, actually feeling something close to peace, when Ezra suddenly froze. "What is it?" Nietzsche asked. "Tracks," he said quietly. "Fresh ones. Someone's been watching the cabin." The peace shattered like thin ice. Nietzsche felt her heart drop into her stomach, felt the old fear come rushing back. They found me. We don't know that yet, but they both knew. The only question was when Jacob Blackwood would come, not if. That night, Ezra sat the family down. "We might have trouble coming," he said simply. "I need all of you to be ready." The girls listened with the focused attention of children who understood that this was serious, that this was real. Ezra laid out escape routes, hiding places, what to do if shooting started. He did not try to soften it or pretend everything would be fine. He treated them like the capable young women they were becoming. On the 10th morning, a stranger rode up to the cabin. He did not dismount, just sat his horse and held out an envelope. "For Ezra Coleman," he said, then turned and rode away before anyone could ask questions. Ezra opened the letter. His face went hard as stone as he read. When he finished, he walked to the fireplace and dropped it into the flames. Nietzsche watched it burn, already knowing what it had said. "Blackwood?" she asked. Ezra nodded. 3 days. He wants you back in 3 days, or there will be consequences. Nietzsche felt her legs go weak. "I have to leave. Tonight. I won't bring this to your family." "You're not going anywhere," Ezra said. His voice was steel. "We're not running. We're going to end this." "How?" Nietzsche's voice broke. "He has an army of men. He has judges, sheriffs, half the territory in his pocket." "I know a place," Ezra said. a settlement called Sanctuary Ridge. People like us. People who protect their own. He looked at his daughters, then back at Naichi. We leave at dawn. All of us. Together. Pearl spoke up, her young voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. How far is it, Papa? 5 days hard riding through the mountains, but we'll make it. He looked at each of his daughters in turn. I need you to trust me. Can you do that? 5 heads nodded. Even Fawn, who did not fully understand what was happening, could feel the weight of the moment. That night, Naichi could not sleep. She sat by the window, watching the stars, thinking about everything that had happened in the past 10 days. From a cage to this. From hopelessness to something that felt dangerously close to hope. A soft knock on her door. Grace slipped in, sat beside her on the bed. Are you scared? The girl asked. Yes, Naichi admitted. Every moment. Me too. But Papa's never let us down. Not once. Your father is a good man. Grace looked at her with eyes that were too old for 13. He likes you, you know, not just as someone to help. He looks at you the way he used to look at Mama. Naichi's heart stuttered. Grace, I don't think that's what this is. Maybe not yet, Grace said. But it could be, if you let it. She left as quietly as she had come. Naichi sat alone in the darkness, turning those words over in her mind like stones in a river. Could it be? Did she even know how to let it be? 2 years with Blackwood had broken something in her, had made her believe that kindness always came with a price, that safety was always temporary. But Ezra Coleman had not asked for anything, had not demanded, had not taken, had simply given. Freedom, safety, a room of her own, respect. Dawn came too soon. They packed quickly, efficiently, taking only what they could carry on 3 mules. Ezra destroyed everything of value left behind. If they come, he said grimly, they get nothing. As they rode away from the cabin, Naichi looked back once. The sun was just touching the roof, turning the logs golden. It had been home for such a short time, but it had been home. The first real home she had known in 2 years. We'll come back, Ezra said, reading her expression. When this is over, we'll come back. Naichi nodded, but did not speak. She did not trust her voice. Instead, she turned her face forward, toward the mountains rising ahead of them, toward Sanctuary Ridge and whatever waited there. Behind them, somewhere in the desert below, Jacob Blackwood was coming. But ahead of them was hope. And for the first time in 2 years, Naichi chose to believe in it. The mountains rose before them like the spine of the world, ancient and indifferent to the small family climbing their flanks. The first day passed in tense silence, everyone listening for sounds of pursuit that did not come. Not yet. But Ezra kept glancing back, his hand never far from the rifle, and Naichi knew he was counting hours, calculating how long before Jacob Blackwood realized where they were heading. The trail climbed steadily upward through pine forests that smelled of resin and snow. The air grew thinner, colder. Fawn rode with Pearl, her small face pressed against her sister's back for warmth. Ruth and Clara shared a mule, Clara asking quiet questions about where they were going, while Ruth sketched the landscape in her mind, storing images for later. Grace rode alone, straight-backed and watchful, already becoming the woman she would need to be. Naichi rode beside Ezra, learning the rhythm of mountain travel, how to read the land, how to spot the places where rock slides might happen, how to find water even when there seemed to be none. He taught her without seeming to teach, just pointing things out in that quiet way of his that assumed she was smart enough to understand. They camped that first night in a trapper's cache Ezra knew, a small shelter built into the mountainside years ago. While the girls huddled around a carefully managed fire, Ezra showed Naichi how to hide their tracks, how to make it look like they had passed through hours earlier than they actually had. "Your wife," Naichi said quietly as they worked. "She was Cherokee?" "She was," Ezra said. "Sarah Red Sky, before she married me. Smartest woman I ever knew." He paused, his hands still on the pine branch he was using to sweep away hoof prints. "She would have liked you." "How do you know?" "Because she always saw people for what they could be, not just what they were." His eyes found hers in the gathering darkness. "She would have seen the same thing I see. Someone worth fighting for." Naichi did not know what to say to that. So she said nothing, just helped him finish hiding their trail and returned to the shelter where the girls were already half asleep. The second day brought the pursuit they had been dreading. Ezra spotted the smoke first, far below them in the valley they had left behind. 8 riders, maybe more, moving fast, too fast to be anyone but Jacob Blackwood's men. Ezra made a decision that showed in the hard set of his jaw. "We leave the third mule. Take only what we absolutely need. We have to move faster." They redistributed the supplies, abandoning anything that was not essential. Food, water, weapons, blankets. Everything else stayed behind. The mule was set free to wander, hopefully drawing the pursuers off their trail for a few hours. By midday they had reached Echo Pass, a narrow canyon with walls that rose hundreds of feet on either side. The trail through it was barely wide enough for the mules, forcing them into single file. Naichi could hear the sound of their passage echoing off the stone, broadcasting their location to anyone within miles. They were halfway through when Naichi heard it, a deep rumbling that seemed to come from the bones of the earth itself. Ezra heard it too. He whipped around, eyes going wide. "Rock slide," he shouted. "Move! Move now!" They spurred the mules forward, racing against the sound of tons of rock beginning to shift above them. The rumbling grew louder, became a roar that drowned out everything else. Naichi looked back and saw the canyon wall coming apart, massive boulders tumbling down in clouds of dust and smaller stones. They burst out of the far end of the pass just as the slide reached its peak. The noise was deafening, a sound like the world ending. When it finally stopped and the dust began to clear, Naichi turned to look back. The canyon was completely blocked. A wall of rock and debris filled Echo Pass from side to side, impassable to anything larger than a rabbit. Ezra sat on his horse, breathing hard, staring at the blocked canyon. "That was close," he said finally. "Too close," Grace said. Her voice was shaking despite her best efforts to control it. Pearl voiced what they were all thinking. "Did you make that happen, Papa? Did you somehow trigger it?" Ezra shook his head. "No, that was just luck. Good or bad, I'm not sure yet." Because while the rock slide had blocked their pursuers, it had also blocked their planned route. The trail they needed to take to Sanctuary Ridge went through Echo Pass. Now they would have to find another way, a harder way. "There's an old Apache trail," Naichi said quietly. "My grandfather showed me once when I was a child. It goes along the cliff face about 3 miles north of here." Ezra looked at her. "How old were you?" "Maybe 8. Can you find it again?" Naichi thought about it, pulling up memories that were 15 years old, filtering them through the changes that time and trauma had made. "I think so, but it's dangerous, very narrow, not meant for mules or horses."
"We don't have a choice," Ezra said.
"Jacob knows these mountains almost as well as I do. He'll find a way around that rock slide eventually. We need to be somewhere he can't follow." They found the Apache Trail 2 hours later, just as the sun was beginning its descent toward the western peaks. Naichi had remembered correctly, but seeing it again as an adult was different from the adventure it had been as a child. The trail was barely 2 feet wide, carved into a cliff face that dropped 500 feet straight down to jagged rocks below. It ran for almost a quarter mile along the vertical stone before climbing back up to safer ground. "I'll go first," Naichi said. "I know the way." Ezra started to protest, then stopped himself. He looked at her for a long moment, and Naichi saw him make the decision to trust her. "All right, but we go slow. Pearl, you carry Fawn. Grace, help Clara. Ruth, stay close to me. Everyone watch where the person in front of you puts their feet." They left the mules behind. There was no choice.
The animals could not make this crossing. Ezra stripped them of the remaining supplies, loading them onto the girls and himself. Then they started across. The trail was worse than Naichi remembered. The wind had eroded it in places, leaving gaps that had to be jumped. The stone was loose in others, crumbling under their feet. But there was no going back now. Behind them was Jacob Blackwood. Ahead was the only path to safety. Naichi led them forward, step by careful step, her body remembering the lessons her grandfather had taught her. Don't look down. Keep your eyes on the path ahead. Trust your feet to find the way. The wind pulled at them, trying to pluck them from the cliff face. The drop yawned below, patient and hungry. They were halfway across when Ruth froze. Naichi heard it in the sudden absence of footsteps behind her. She turned carefully, moving nothing but her head, and saw the girl pressed against the cliff face, eyes squeezed shut, body rigid with terror.
"I can't," Ruth whispered. "I can't move." Naichi looked back at Ezra. His face was gray, but his voice was steady. "Talk to her. You're closest." Naichi inched back along the trail until she was beside Ruth. She spoke in Apache first, the language of her grandfather, letting the familiar sounds wrap around the terrified girl. Then she switched to English. "Look at me, Ruth. Don't look down. Just look at my eyes." Ruth's eyes opened, found Naichi's face. "My grandfather brought me here when I was younger than you," Naichi said. "He told me that fear is like smoke. You can't hold it. You can't fight it. You just let it pass through you. Do you understand?" Ruth nodded, barely. "Good. Now I'm going to hold your hand, and we're going to take one step. Just one. Can you do that?" Another tiny nod. Naichi reached out and took Ruth's hand. It was small and cold and shaking. Together they took one step, then another, then another. Behind them, the rest of the family followed, everyone holding their breath, until finally, after what felt like hours, but was probably only 20 minutes, they reached the far side. They collapsed on solid ground, everyone shaking, several of them crying. Ezra pulled each of his daughters into a fierce hug, then looked at Naichi with something in his eyes that made her heart skip. "Thank you," he said simply. Naichi nodded, not trusting herself to speak. They could hear shouts from far below now. Jacob's men had reached the rock slide and were looking for a way around. But the Apache Trail was invisible from below, known only to those who had been taught its secrets. They had bought themselves time. That night they camped in a shallow cave Naichi remembered from her childhood visit. It was barely large enough for all of them, but it was shelter and it was hidden. Ezra built a small fire, keeping the smoke minimal. They ate cold rations and huddled together for warmth.
Naichi performed a small ceremony her grandfather had taught her, burning sage and speaking words in Apache that asked the mountain spirits for protection. The girls watched in fascination. Even Pearl, who had been so suspicious in the beginning, seemed moved by the ritual. When it was done, Grace spoke up. "Thank you for saving Ruth today." "We save each other," Naichi said. "That is what family does." The word hung in the air. Family. She had not meant to say it, but once it was out, she could not take it back. Did not want to take it back. Pearl looked at her father, then at Naichi. "Is that what we are?" she asked. "A family?" Ezra's eyes found Naichi's across the firelight. "That's up to all of us," he said. "But I'd like to think so." That night, Naichi dreamed of her grandfather. He stood at the edge of the cliff, the Apache trail behind him, and he smiled at her. "The mountain has tested you," he said in her dream, "but you are not alone. You never were." She woke to find an eagle feather lying beside her head. There was no way it should have been there, in a cave with no opening above them. But there it was, brown and white and perfect. A sign, her grandfather would have said. Protection from the spirits. Naichi tucked it carefully into her belt and did not mention it to anyone. Some things were too sacred for words. The third day brought a storm that seemed to come from nowhere. The sky turned the color of old bruises, and snow began to fall, thick and fast. Within an hour, the world had disappeared into white chaos. They could barely see 10 feet ahead of them. "We need shelter," Ezra shouted over the wind. "Now!" Naichi remembered something else. A wickiup, an Apache dwelling, that her grandfather had built near here as an emergency shelter. It had been 15 years. It might be gone, but it might still be standing. She led them through the storm, navigating by memory and instinct, praying to spirits she was not sure she still believed in. And there, half buried in snow and barely visible, was the wickiup. Still standing, still sound enough to provide shelter from the killing cold. They piled inside, all 7 of them, pressed together in a space meant for 3 or 4. But it was dry, and the walls blocked the wind, and when Ezra got a fire going in the center, the temperature slowly climbed from deadly to merely miserable. Fawn began to shiver uncontrollably. Her lips turned blue. Clara wrapped her in every blanket they had, but the shivering got worse. "Hypothermia," Ezra said, his voice tight with fear. "We need to warm her up, fast." Naichi stripped to her undershirt and pulled Fawn against her bare skin, wrapping them both in blankets. The other girls piled on top, adding their body heat. Ezra built up the fire as high as he dared. For 2 hours they fought for Fawn's life, forcing warm water down her throat, rubbing her hands and feet, talking to her constantly to keep her conscious. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the shivering began to ease. Color returned to Fawn's lips. Her eyes focused. She looked up at Naichi and whispered, "I knew you'd save me." The storm raged for another full day and night. They were trapped in the wickiup with dwindling supplies and no way to hunt or gather more. Naichi showed them how to find edible roots beneath the snow, how to set snares for rabbits, how to make the wickiup warmer by adding layers of pine boughs to the walls. On the second night of the storm, with everyone else asleep, Ezra spoke to Naichi across the dying fire. "You've saved us more times than I can count now." "We save each other," Naichi repeated. "That's what you said. That's what family does." "Is that what you want?" Ezra asked. "To be part of this family?" Naichi thought about it. About the cage in Copper Springs. about the 2 years with Blackwood, about everything she had lost and everything she had, somehow, impossibly, found. "Yes," she said, "more than anything." Ezra nodded slowly. "When this is over, when we're safe at Sanctuary Ridge, there's something I want to ask you. But not now. Not while we're running. When we're safe." Naichi's heart was pounding, but she kept her voice steady. "I'll be waiting." The storm finally broke on the morning of the 5th day. They emerged from the wickiup into a world transformed by snow. Everything white and clean and new. The temperature had dropped, but the sky was clear, the sun brilliant on the fresh powder. They were 3 days behind schedule now. Sanctuary Ridge was still 2 days away, maybe 3 in the deep snow. And somewhere behind them, Jacob Blackwood was still coming. But they were alive, all of them, and they were together. That, Naichi thought, as they packed up to continue their journey, was worth every hardship they had faced. The descent into the valley where Sanctuary Ridge lay hidden took another 2 days of hard travel through snow that came up to the mules' bellies in places. Grace's ankle, twisted during the crossing of the Apache Trail, had swollen badly. She could not walk without crying out in pain, so they fashioned a travois from pine branches and blankets, taking turns pulling her through the deep drifts. Naichi spotted the smoke first on the afternoon of the 8th day, 2 days behind their original schedule. A thin column rising from the valley below, too organized to be a forest fire, too substantial to be a campfire. Settlement smoke. The smoke of civilization carved out of wilderness by people who refused to be broken. "Is that it?" Clara asked, her voice small with exhaustion and hope mixed together. "That's it," Ezra confirmed. "Sanctuary Ridge." They emerged from the tree line onto a ridge that overlooked the hidden valley. What Naichi saw took her breath away. Not because it was grand or impressive in the way that cities were impressive, but because it existed at all. 60 or 70 buildings clustered together in a pattern that suggested planning and permanence. A wooden watchtower rose above the settlement, manned by someone who was probably already watching them approach. Defensive walls, not high but sturdy, ringed the outer buildings. But it was the people that made Naichi's chest tighten with something she was afraid to name. Even from this distance, she could see them moving through the streets. Black faces, brown faces, white faces, all working side by side. Children of every shade, playing together in the snow. A woman in traditional Mexican dress hanging laundry next to a man in buckskins who might have been Navajo or Apache or any of a dozen other tribes. This was what hope looked like when it took physical form. They were stopped at the entrance by 2 guards. One was a black man in his 50s, with gray in his beard and eyes that had seen too much suffering to ever be completely soft again. The other was a Mexican woman, around 40, with a rifle held casually but competently across her chest. "State your business," the man said. His voice was not unfriendly, but it was not exactly welcoming either. Sanctuary Ridge protected its own, and strangers had to prove they belonged. Ezra straightened in his saddle, despite the exhaustion that showed in every line of his body. "I'm looking for Moses Freeman. Tell him Ezra Coleman is calling in his marker." The black man's expression changed, cycling through surprise and recognition, and something that might have been joy. "Ezra Coleman? I'll be damned." He stepped forward, peering up at Ezra with new eyes. "Didn't think I'd see you again after you disappeared into those mountains 5 years back." "Life's full of surprises," Ezra said. His mouth quirked in something that was almost a smile. "Moses,
I need help. The kind you owe me." Moses's eyes swept over the group. 5 exhausted girls, 1 on a travois. An Apache woman who looked like she had been through hell and come out the other side changed. 2 mules that were on their last legs. And Ezra Coleman himself, looking harder and more desperate than Moses had ever seen him. "What kind of trouble?" Moses asked. "The worst kind," Ezra said. Cornelius Blackwood, the woman with the rifle, made a sharp sound. The Mexican woman, Rosa, Moses called her, stepped forward with fury and old grief warring in her expression. "Blackwood's men killed my brother last year. If you're running from him, you have sanctuary here." Moses nodded slowly. "Bring them in. We'll get them settled. Then you and I need to talk." He glanced at Naichi, then back to Ezra. "All of you need to talk, I'm thinking." They were taken to a cabin on the eastern edge of the settlement. It was small, but solid, with 2 rooms and a stone fireplace that someone had already stocked with wood. Women appeared almost immediately with food and blankets. A Chinese man who introduced himself as Dr. Samuel Chen examined Grace's ankle with gentle, skilled hands. "Badly sprained, but not broken," he announced. "No walking for 2 weeks. Rest and elevation. I'll prepare a poultice." Children came to the door, peeking in with unabashed curiosity at the new arrivals. Fawn and Clara were drawn to them like iron to a lodestone, and within minutes they were outside playing in the snow with kids who spoke a babble of languages and did not care that they could not understand each other completely. Play was a universal language. Naichi stood at the window, watching them, her throat tight. An old Apache woman walked up to her, moving with the careful dignity of someone whose body hurt, but whose spirit remained unbroken. The woman spoke in Apache, the first Apache words Naichi had heard from anyone except herself in more than 2 years. "Welcome, daughter. You are safe here." Naichi turned to look at the woman, really look at her. She was perhaps 70, her face a map of hard years survived. But her eyes were kind, and her smile was real. Naichi felt something break open inside her chest, and suddenly she was crying, great heaving sobs that she had been holding back for days or months or years. The old woman, who later introduced herself as Grandmother Julia, simply held her and let her cry. When the storm passed, Julia pulled back and looked at Naichi with eyes that seemed to see everything. "You are broken pottery," she said in Apache. "But broken pottery, mended with gold, is more beautiful than it was before. You are not broken, daughter. You are becoming." That night, Moses called a council meeting in the main hall. Ezra and Naichi attended, leaving the girls in the care of several settlement women who seemed to specialize in making children feel safe. The council consisted of Moses, Rosa, Dr. Chen, a black preacher named Reverend Isaiah Carter, and a Navajo man named William Greyhawk, who carried himself like the warrior he had been. Ezra laid it all out. The cage in Copper Springs, Naichi's 2 years of slavery under Blackwood, the escape and recapture, his purchase of her contract and the letter threatening his daughters, their flight through the mountains, and most importantly, what was coming behind them. "Jacob Blackwood has 8 men, maybe 10, Ezra said. "He's the best tracker I've ever known besides myself. He'll find this place. Not today, maybe not tomorrow, but he'll find it. And when he does, he won't ask nicely." Moses leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled under his chin. This community was built to resist men like Blackwood. "We've got 40 men who can fight, and about 15 women who won't take kindly to being left out of that number. We've got defenses, we've got weapons, and most importantly, we've got something worth fighting for." "What we don't have," Rosa said quietly, "is the law on our side. Blackwood owns judges, sheriffs, politicians. If we kill his men, even in self-defense, we could bring the full weight of the territorial government down on us. Then we don't kill unless we have to, Reverend Carter said. But we don't hand over one of our own either. He looked at Nietzsche. And you are one of our own now, sister. That's what sanctuary means. William Greyhawk spoke up for the first time. I'll train the men, and the women who want it. We'll be ready when they come. Nietzsche found her voice, surprising herself. I know how Jacob fights. He's cruel. He enjoys causing pain. But he's also overconfident. He thinks everyone he faces will be weaker than him, easier to break. We can use that against him.
Moses studied her with new respect. Keep talking. For the next hour, they planned. Defensive positions, fallback points, where to hide the children and elderly if shooting started. William Greyhawk sketched out firing lanes and choke points. Rosa identified buildings that could be sacrificed if fire was used as a weapon. Dr. Chen prepared emergency medical supplies in 3 different locations in case one was compromised. When the meeting finally broke up near midnight, Ezra walked Nietzsche back to their cabin. The settlement was quiet now, most people asleep. Snow crunched under their boots, and their breath made white clouds in the cold air. You did good in there, Ezra said, the way you spoke up, the way you analyzed Jacob's weaknesses. I survived him for 2 years, Nietzsche said. I learned how he thinks. They walked in silence for a moment. Then Ezra said, I meant what I said back in the wiki-up, about asking you something when we were safe. We're not safe yet. Safe enough. He stopped walking and turned to face her. The moon was bright on the snow, turning everything silver and shadow. Nietzsche, I know this is fast. I know we've only known each other a handful of weeks, but life doesn't always give us time to go slow. Ezra, she started, let me finish. He took her hands in his, and Nietzsche realized they were shaking slightly. His hands, which had been so steady through everything, were shaking. Sarah was the love of my life. I thought I'd never feel that way again. Thought that part of me died with her. But you've brought something back that I thought was gone forever. Hope. Not just for me, for all of us. I don't know how to do this, Nietzsche whispered. How to be a wife, how to be a mother. Blackwood. He damaged me in ways I don't know if I can heal from. You're already healing, Ezra said. I see it every day. The way you are with my daughters. The way you led us through the Apache Trail. The way you spoke in that council meeting like you belonged there. Because you do belong. Here. With us. If you want to. Nietzsche looked into his eyes and saw no deception there. No hidden price. No trap waiting to spring. Just a man who had lost everything and was brave enough to risk losing it again. Just a man who saw her not as property or as damaged goods, but as someone worth choosing, worth fighting for, worth loving. Yes, she said. The word came out barely above a whisper, but it carried the weight of a vow. Yes, I want that. Ezra pulled her close and kissed her. It was gentle at first, tentative, 2 people learning each other. Then it deepened, and Nietzsche felt something inside her that had been frozen for 2 years began to thaw. Not all at once, not completely, but enough to know that healing was possible, that she could be more than what Blackwood had tried to make her. They were still kissing when the warning bell began to ring. The sound cut through the night like a blade. Nietzsche jerked back, her heart already racing. No, not yet. Not now. Riders approaching, someone shouted from the watchtower. 8 men, coming fast. Jacob had found them. The settlement erupted into organized chaos. Men and women grabbed weapons and moved to defensive positions they had just finished planning hours before. Children were herded into the central lodge, a stone building with walls thick enough to stop bullets. Ezra ran toward the cabin to make sure his daughters were safe. Naichi followed, her mind already shifting into survival mode. The girls were awake, frightened but not panicking. Grace had armed herself with their father's spare rifle, despite her injured ankle. Pearl held Clara and Fawn close. Ruth stood by the window, watching. "Papa," Grace said when Ezra burst through the door, "what do we do?" "You go to the lodge with the other children," Ezra said. "Now, all of you." "What about you?" Pearl asked. "Your father and I are going to end this," Naichi said. She was surprised by how steady her voice was, how calm she felt now that the moment had finally arrived. No more running, no more hiding. Tonight it ended, one way or another. Moses appeared in the doorway. "They're at the edge of town. Jacob Blackwood's asking to parley." Ezra looked at Naichi. "This is your fight as much as mine. What do you want to do?" "I want to face him," Naichi said. "I want him to see that I'm not afraid anymore." They walked to the defensive wall together. Moses and Rosa flanked them. William Greyhawk was already there with a rifle, positioned on a rooftop where he had a clear shot at the riders below. Other defenders were scattered throughout the buildings, invisible in the darkness, but ready. Jacob Blackwood sat his horse at the edge of the settlement, backlit by torches his men carried. He was exactly as Naichi remembered, tall and lean, with a scar running down the right side of his face from a knife fight he had barely won. His eyes were the kind of cold that came from a soul that had stopped caring about anything except power and pain. "Ezra Coleman," Jacob called out. His voice carried clearly in the cold night air. "Send out the Apache whore, and we'll leave peaceful." "There's no property here," Moses called back. "Only free people." Jacob laughed. "Free? She's Apache. She's got about as much right to freedom as a rattlesnake." "This settlement doesn't recognize slavery of any kind," Rosa said. Her voice shook with controlled fury. "We've all run from men like you. We're done running." "Then this settlement's going to burn," Jacob said. "Simple as that." Naichi stepped forward before anyone could stop her. She climbed up onto the wall so Jacob could see her clearly in the moonlight. "I'm here, Jacob Blackwood." Jacob's expression changed. Surprise, then satisfaction, then something darker. "Well, well, lost some weight in that cage, didn't you? But you're still just as much trouble as ever." "I'm not going back," Naichi said. Her voice rang out clear and strong. "I would rather die." "That can be arranged," Jacob said. He started to dismount. "But I won't die alone," Naichi continued. She raised the rifle she had been holding at her side. "I'll take you with me. That's a promise." Jacob froze halfway off his horse. Around them, the tension coiled tighter. His men reached for their weapons. The hidden defenders of Sanctuary Ridge aimed from their positions. One wrong move, and bullets would fly. Ezra climbed up beside Naichi. "You want her? You go through me. And everyone here." Behind them, as if summoned by his words, the people of Sanctuary Ridge emerged from their hiding places. One by one, they stepped into view. 40 men, 15 women, all armed, all standing together, black and white and brown and red, Christian and pagan and everything in between, bound together by one simple truth. This was their home,
and they would defend it. Grandmother Julia's voice carried from the back of the crowd. "We've all fought before. We'll fight again." Jacob looked at the assembled defenders, and Nietzsche saw something flicker in his eyes. Not fear, not quite, but calculation. The realization that this was not going to be the easy retrieval he had planned. That people who had nothing left to lose fought harder than people who still had something they were afraid of losing. "You really want to die for an Apache?" Jacob asked Ezra. "We'd die for any one of ours," Moses said. "That's what community means." Jacob sat back in his saddle. His hand moved toward his gun. "Fine," he said. "Then die." The first shot shattered the night. What happened next would be told and retold in Sanctuary Ridge for years to come. Jacob's men charged forward on horseback, shooting as they came. The defenders returned fire from cover, their shots more measured, more accurate. 2 of Jacob's men fell in the first volley, tumbling from their saddles. The riders who made it past the initial barrage found themselves in a maze of buildings they did not know, facing defenders who had the high ground and knew every firing angle. William Greyhawk dropped a 3rd man with a shot that spoke of years of training as a warrior. Rosa shot a 4th through the shoulder, sending him fleeing back into the darkness. Jacob, seeing his advantage crumbling, did what cruel men always do when they start to lose. He went for the children. He broke away from the main fight and circled around toward the lodge where the kids were sheltered. Grace saw him coming through the window and screamed a warning. Nietzsche heard it. She was off the wall and running before her mind fully processed what was happening. Jacob was heading for the lodge, for Fawn and Clara and Ruth and all the other children who had done nothing except exist in his path. Running on instinct and fury and 2 years of suppressed rage, Nietzsche intercepted him at the door. Jacob was bigger, stronger, a trained fighter who had killed more people than he could probably remember. But Nietzsche had survived him for 2 years, had learned his patterns, his tells, the places where arrogance made him sloppy. When he swung at her, she was already moving, ducking under his arm and driving her knife toward his ribs. He twisted away, and the blade scraped across his coat instead of sinking into flesh. They fought in the snow outside the lodge, brutal and close, while gunfire continued around them. Jacob got his hands around her throat. Nietzsche drove her knee up into his stomach. He released her, and she stumbled back, gasping. "Remember the whip?" Jacob said. His smile was blood on his teeth. "Remember how you screamed?" "I remember promising to kill you," Nietzsche said. Jacob pulled the knife. So did Nietzsche. They circled each other in the snow, while inside the lodge, children huddled together, praying to gods who might or might not be listening. That's when Ezra arrived. He hit Jacob from the side like an avalanche, all that mountain strength focused into pure, protective fury. The 2 men went down in a tangle of limbs and violence. Ezra was older, but Jacob was meaner. They traded blows that would have felled smaller men, rolling in the snow, each trying to get the upper hand. "Your Apache bitch killed one of my men," Jacob snarled. "She's not a bitch," Ezra said through gritted teeth. "She's the woman I love, and you're not taking her." Jacob managed to get his knife free and slashed at Ezra's arm. Blood bloomed on the buckskin. But Ezra did not let go. Instead, he used the pain to fuel his next move, slamming Jacob's knife hand against the ground until the weapon went flying. Then he had Jacob pinned, his hand around the man's throat, his face inches from Jacob's. "It's over," Ezra said. Nietzsche appeared beside them, her rifle aimed at Jacob's head. She could pull the trigger, end this. And the man who had tormented her for 2 years, who had scarred her body and tried to scar her soul. Her finger was on the trigger,
All it would take was a little pressure. "Do it," Jacob gasped. "Prove you're the savage they say." Nietzsche stared down at him, at this man who represented everything that had been taken from her. And she made a choice that surprised everyone, including herself. She lowered the rifle. "No," she said. "I won't let you make me into what you are." "Ezra," she said. Her voice was steady now, certain. "Let him up. Let him stand." Ezra hesitated, then released Jacob and stepped back. Jacob climbed to his feet, clutching his throat, his eyes full of hate and confusion. "You're going to jail," Nietzsche said. "You're going to face a judge and a jury. You're going to answer for what you've done, not just to me, to all of us." "There ain't no jail that'll hold me," Jacob said. "Cornelius will buy me out." "Maybe," Nietzsche said. "But today, right now, I choose mercy over murder.
I choose to be better than you." Moses's men moved in and restrained Jacob. The few of his riders who had survived were also being rounded up. One settler lay dead, a Navajo warrior named William Greyhawk, who had taken a bullet protecting the lodge. 5 others were wounded but would survive. As the sun began to rise over Sanctuary Ridge, painting the snow gold and pink, the settlement took stock. They had won. Not without cost, but they had won. And more importantly, they had proven something, that people who others had thrown away could build something worth protecting. That community was stronger than cruelty. That hope, however battered, could still triumph. Nietzsche stood with Ezra as the sun came up, his wounded arm bandaged, her hands still shaking from what she had almost done, but chose not to. Around them, Sanctuary Ridge began the work of healing, of burying their dead with honor, of tending their wounded with care. "It's over," Ezra said quietly. Nietzsche nodded. "It's over." And for the first time in 2 years, she believed it. The day after the battle, Sanctuary Ridge buried William Greyhawk with the honors befitting a warrior who had given his life protecting children. The Navajo ceremony was simple but profound, conducted by his younger brother who had arrived from a neighboring settlement. Nietzsche stood with the other women, singing the death song in Apache, the words different but the meaning the same. A good man had fallen so that others might live. His name would be remembered. Ezra's arm had been stitched up by Dr. Chen, who worked with the calm efficiency of a man who had seen far worse. 15 stitches and a warning to take it easy for 2 weeks. Ezra had nodded, but they both knew he would not rest. There was too much to be done. Jacob Blackwood and his 3 surviving men were locked in the settlement's reinforced storage building that served as a makeshift jail. The 2 who had died in the fighting had been buried outside the settlement's walls, marked only with wooden crosses and no names. Moses sent riders to Fort Apache to notify the army about the prisoners. He also sent word to the territorial governor, a man named Samuel Fremont, who had a reputation for being harder to buy than most politicians. If Cornelius Blackwood's network was going to crumble, it would start with testimony from the people he had hurt. And there were more of those people than anyone had realized. 3 days after the battle, a woman arrived at Sanctuary Ridge. She was Mexican, maybe 30 years old, with burn scars on her arms and a hardness in her eyes that spoke of suffering survived. Her name was Maria. She had escaped from one of Blackwood's establishments in Tucson 6 months before Nietzsche. When she heard that Jacob Blackwood had been captured, she rode for 3 days straight to tell her story to anyone who would listen. Then another woman came, and another. Within a week,
7 women had arrived, each with their own tale of slavery and abuse under Cornelius Blackwood's system. Some had been Apache, like Nietzsche. Others were Mexican, Chinese, even 2 white women who had been sold into servitude to pay their dead husbands' debts. The law might have said it was legal, but every one of them knew slavery when they lived it. Rosa organized them, helped them write down their testimonies in clear, simple language that no judge could ignore. Dr. Chen tended to their lingering injuries, documenting scars and broken bones that had healed badly. Reverend Carter offered spiritual comfort to those who wanted it, and silent companionship to those who did not. And Nietzsche found herself at the center of it all, not because she sought that position, but because the other women looked to her as someone who had fought back and won. She spent hours listening to their stories, recognizing her own pain reflected in their eyes. She held Maria when the woman broke down, remembering her daughter, who had died in one of Blackwood's mines. She sat with a Chinese girl named Lin, who had been 14 when she was sold, and was now 16 and pregnant with a child she had not chosen to conceive. One evening, Grandmother Julia found Nietzsche sitting alone outside the cabin, staring at the stars. The old Apache woman settled beside her with the careful movements of someone whose bones ached, but whose spirit would not bend. "You carry their pain now," Julia said in Apache. "That is a heavy burden." "Someone has to," Nietzsche replied. "How do you not carry it?" Nietzsche asked. "How do you hear these stories and not let them destroy you?" "You witness their pain," Julia said gently. "You honor it by listening. But carrying it all would break even the strongest woman." She placed a weathered hand on Nietzsche's shoulder. "You are also what you choose to become after." She gestured at the settlement around them. Every person here was broken by the world outside, but we came here and we chose to build instead of break. That is how we survive. Nietzsche thought about that, about the choice she had made not to kill Jacob Blackwood, about the choice to trust Ezra Coleman, about all the small choices that had led her from that cage in Copper Springs to this moment under stars that seemed brighter here than anywhere else. 3 weeks after the battle, word came back from the territorial governor. An investigation was being opened into Cornelius Blackwood's business practices. Federal marshals were involved now, which meant Blackwood's bought judges and sheriffs could not interfere. The testimony of the 7 women, combined with Nietzsche's statement and evidence gathered from Blackwood's own records, was building a case that even money and influence could not easily dismiss. Jacob Blackwood remained in custody, waiting to be transferred to Fort Apache for military trial. He had stopped his threats and bluster after the first week, settling into a sullen silence that was somehow more unsettling than his rage had been. Nietzsche avoided the building where he was kept. She had said what she needed to say to him. Now he was simply a problem for the law to solve. It was during this time, in the quiet weeks while they waited for news, that Ezra finally asked the question he had tried to ask on the night of the battle. They were walking by the creek that ran along the eastern edge of Sanctuary Ridge. The snow was melting now, revealing green grass underneath. Spring was coming early this year, the settler said, a good omen. The girls were at the settlement school, learning reading and arithmetic from a former teacher who had fled north to escape a husband who beat her. "Nietzsche," Ezra said, stopping by a particularly large pine tree. "I asked you once if you wanted to be part of this family." "I remember," Nietzsche said. Her heart was already beating faster. "You said yes, but I don't think I was clear about what I was asking." He turned to face her, his blue eyes serious. "I wasn't asking if you wanted to help raise my daughters, or share a cabin, or any of those practical things. I was asking if you would marry me."
Naichi felt the words hit her like a physical force. Marriage. Not just living together, not just helping with the children, but actual marriage. Legal and binding and permanent, in a way that terrified and thrilled her in equal measure. "Ezra," she started, "I don't know if I can be a wife. Not the way Sarah was." "I'm not asking you to be Sarah," Ezra said. "I'm asking you to be yourself. The woman who led my daughters across that Apache trail. The woman who faced down Jacob Blackwood without flinching. The woman who chooses mercy when she has every right to choose vengeance. That's the woman I love. That's the woman I want to spend the rest of my life with." "What about the girls?" Naichi asked. "Do they know you're asking this?" A small cough came from behind the pine tree. Then Grace's voice, slightly embarrassed. "We might have followed you." All 5 daughters emerged from various hiding places. Pearl looked defiant. Ruth was crying happy tears. Clara was grinning. Fawn was bouncing with barely contained excitement. "We already think of you as our mother," Pearl said. "We have for weeks now." "Please say yes," Fawn begged. "Please, please, please." Naichi looked at these 5 girls who had accepted her without question, who had followed her through danger without complaint, who had given her a family when she thought she would never have one again. Then she looked at Ezra, this mountain of a man who had broken open a cage, and in doing so had broken open her heart. "Yes," she said. The word came out choked with emotion, but clear enough. "Yes, I will marry you." Fawn squealed and launched herself at Naichi, wrapping small arms around her waist. The other girls joined in, creating a pile of embraces and laughter and tears. Ezra stood back for a moment, watching his daughters welcome Naichi into the family officially, and the expression on his face was one of pure joy. When the celebration finally calmed down, Grace spoke up. "We need to plan a wedding." And so they did. The women of Sanctuary Ridge threw themselves into preparations with an enthusiasm that overwhelmed Naichi. She tried to protest that it did not need to be elaborate, that simple would be fine, but they would not hear of it. "After what you've been through," Mrs. Abbott said firmly, "you deserve a celebration." Rosa took charge of making a dress, recruiting other women to help with the sewing. The fabric was simple white cotton, but Rosa embroidered it with Apache designs in blue and red thread, creating something that honored Naichi's heritage while fitting the occasion. Grandmother Julia contributed beadwork, tiny glass beads in patterns that told stories of strength and survival. Reverend Carter would perform the Christian ceremony. Grandmother Julia would conduct the Apache blessing. The whole thing would happen on the first Sunday after the snow fully melted, which the old-timers predicted would be in about 2 weeks. The days leading up to the wedding were some of the happiest Naichi had ever known. She spent time with each of the girls individually, learning their hopes and dreams, their fears and secrets. Grace confided that she was interested in a boy named Tall Pine, a 13-year-old Apache boy whose family had arrived at Sanctuary Ridge the year before. Pearl admitted that she wanted to be a doctor, like Dr. Chen. Ruth showed Naichi her sketches, hundreds of them, capturing life in Sanctuary Ridge with an artist's eye. Clara asked endless questions about Apache culture, soaking up knowledge like desert sand soaking up rain. And Fawn simply stayed close, as if afraid that if she let Naichi out of her sight, this dream might dissolve. 1 week before the wedding, official word came. Cornelius Blackwood had been arrested in Tucson. Federal marshals had raided his offices and found records detailing 2 decades of trafficking in human beings. Not just Apache women, but Chinese laborers, Mexican families,
even white immigrants who had the misfortune of owing him money. The scope of his operation was staggering. Judges were being investigated. Sheriffs were being removed from office. The whole corrupt system that had allowed him to operate was being torn apart from the inside. As for Jacob Blackwood, he had been transferred to Fort Apache and was awaiting trial for murder. Not the attempted kidnapping of Nietzsche, but for the killing of an Apache family 3 years earlier, in an incident that had been covered up at the time.
One of the 7 women who had come to Sanctuary Ridge had witnessed it and was willing to testify. The penalty for murder was hanging. When Nietzsche heard the news, she felt something she had not expected. Not joy, exactly, but a kind of settling. Justice was not revenge. It was not personal satisfaction. It was simply the world working the way it was supposed to work, where people faced consequences for their actions, and survivors got to tell their stories and be believed. That evening, she told Ezra about the feeling. They were sitting on the porch of their cabin, watching the sun set over the mountains. In a week, they would be married. In a week, this would be their home together, not just a temporary shelter, but a permanent foundation. "I thought I would feel happier," Nietzsche admitted, "knowing that Blackwood is going to jail, that Jacob might hang. But mostly, I just feel tired." "That's because revenge is exhausting," Ezra said. "Justice is just the world returning to balance. It's supposed to feel quiet." "Is this what balance feels like?" Nietzsche asked. "I think so," Ezra said. He took her hand. "For the first time in 3 years, I feel like the world makes sense again. Like there's order instead of chaos. That's balance." They sat in comfortable silence for a while. Then Nietzsche said, "I'm scared." "Of what?" "Of being happy." She looked at him. "Every time I've been happy before, it got taken away. My family, my freedom, my dignity. What if this gets taken away too?" Ezra was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "I can't promise nothing bad will ever happen. Life doesn't work that way. But I can promise that whatever comes, we'll face it together. You're not alone anymore, Nietzsche. You're never going to be alone again." The wedding took place on a Sunday morning when the air smelled like pine and new grass and possibility. The entire settlement turned out. More than 200 people gathered in a meadow just outside the walls. Someone had built a simple arch from pine branches and early wildflowers. Chairs had been arranged in rows, though many people chose to stand. Nietzsche wore the dress Rosa had made, her hair braided with wildflowers by the 5 girls who were now officially her daughters. She walked down the makeshift aisle alone, by her own choice, because she was not property to be given away, but a woman making her own decision. Ezra waited at the arch, dressed in clean buckskins with a Cherokee sash that had belonged to Sarah. He had trimmed his beard and combed his hair, but he was still fundamentally himself, rough and strong and real. Grandmother Julia began with the Apache ceremony, speaking words that called on the spirits of the 4 directions to bless this union. She burned sage and cedar, the smoke rising into the clear spring air. Nietzsche felt tears on her cheeks, but they were good tears, cleansing tears, the kind that washed away old pain to make room for new joy. Then Reverend Carter took over for the Christian portion. "Dearly beloved," he began, and Nietzsche felt the weight of those words. Beloved. She was beloved now. By this man, by these girls, by this community that had taken her in and made her one of their own. The vows were simple. Ezra promised to honor her past, protect her present, and build her future. Nietzsche promised to love his daughters as her own blood, to stand with him always, to be his strength when he weakened. They exchanged rings, his mother's wedding band that he had saved for 3 years, not knowing why, and a band made by the settlement's blacksmith from silver mined in these very mountains. "By the power vested in me," Reverend Carter said, "I now pronounce you husband and wife. You may kiss the bride." Ezra pulled her close and kissed her, while the settlement erupted in cheers. The girls rushed forward, throwing their arms around both of them, and suddenly it was not just a couple standing there, but a family.
7 people who had found each other through tragedy and had chosen to become something stronger than any of them could be alone. The celebration that followed lasted until nightfall. There was food from every culture represented in the settlement: Mexican tamales and Apache piqui bread, and Chinese dumplings and Southern barbecue, all laid out on long tables. Music played, a mix of fiddles and guitars and drums that created something new from old traditions. Children ran wild, while adults danced and laughed and told stories. Nietzsche danced with each of her daughters, holding them close and whispering promises of love and protection. She danced with Ezra, their bodies moving together as if they had been doing this for years instead of weeks. She danced with Moses and Rosa and Dr. Chen and Grandmother Julia, all the people who had helped make this moment possible. As the sun set and the first stars appeared, Moses called for quiet. He stood on a makeshift platform and cleared his throat. "I have an announcement," he said. "This community has built something special here. We've built a place where everyone is welcome, where no one is turned away for the color of their skin or the God they pray to or the language they speak. And today, we need to make that official." He gestured to the cabin that Ezra and Nietzsche had been staying in. "This community has built a new cabin for the Coleman family, bigger than the old one, with room for everyone. It's yours for as long as you want it, for as long as you'll have us." Ezra looked stunned. "Moses, we can't accept that. It's too much." "You can and you will," Rosa said, stepping forward. "You risked everything to bring Nietzsche here. You stood with us when Blackwood's men came. You're one of us now, all of you. This is what family does." Nietzsche felt her throat close with emotion. She looked at Ezra, at their daughters, at this community that had embraced them. "Thank you," she managed to say, "for everything." The celebration continued late into the night, but eventually Ezra and Nietzsche slipped away to their new cabin. The girls had been taken to sleep at various neighbors' houses, giving the newlyweds their first night alone together. The cabin was beautiful, larger than the old one, with 2 separate bedrooms for the girls, a main room with a stone fireplace, and a sleeping loft for Ezra and Nietzsche. Furniture had been donated by various families. Quilts covered the beds. Food filled the shelves. It was ready to be a home. Nietzsche stood in the center of the main room, slowly turning to take it all in. "Is this real?" she whispered. Ezra came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist. "It's real. We're real. This is our life now." She turned in his arms to face him. "I'm still scared sometimes, that I'm not enough, that I'm too damaged." "You're not damaged," Ezra said firmly. "You're a survivor. There's a difference." He touched her face gently. "And you're more than enough. You're everything." They stood there in their new home, in their new life, and Nietzsche felt something shift inside her. Not healing, not yet, because healing takes time, but the beginning of healing. The first green shoots pushing up through soil that had been scorched and salted and left for dead. Life, finding a way despite everything. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. There would be hard days ahead, moments when the past came roaring back, times when Nietzsche would need to remember how to breathe through the panic.
But tonight, in this moment, she was safe. She was loved. She was home. And that, she thought as Ezra led her toward the sleeping loft, was more than she had ever dared to hope for. 2 years passed like water flowing over stones, changing everything slowly but completely. The cabin that had seemed so large when they first moved in now felt full of life in the best possible way. Grace had grown into a young woman of 15, already being courted by Tall Pine with all the careful formality that Apache tradition required. Pearl, at 13, had become Dr. Chen's apprentice, learning medicine with a dedication that spoke of true calling. Ruth's artwork now decorated homes throughout Sanctuary Ridge, her sketches capturing moments of beauty in ordinary life. Clara, at 8, read everything she could find, already talking about becoming a teacher. And Fawn, at 6, moved between English and the Cherokee words her mother had taught her, with an ease that made language seem like music. But the biggest change was the one that Naichi carried within her body. 8 months pregnant, moving through the world with the careful grace of a woman who understood that she was no longer just herself, but a vessel for new life. The baby moved constantly now, pressing against her ribs, reminding her with every kick that the future was not just something to hope for, but something growing inside her right now. It was a spring morning, warm and bright, when the rider came. He was not from Sanctuary Ridge, but from Fort Apache, a young soldier who looked barely old enough to shave. He carried newspapers from Tucson and Phoenix, and in those papers was the news they had been waiting 2 years to hear. Cornelius Blackwood had been convicted. 20 years in the territorial prison for human trafficking, fraud, and conspiracy. The trial had taken 18 months, had involved testimony from more than 40 victims, had exposed a network of corruption that reached into every level of territorial government. Judges had been removed, sheriffs had been fired, laws had been changed to make it harder for men like Blackwood to operate in the shadows. As for Jacob Blackwood, the newspapers reported his execution with clinical detachment. Hanged by the neck until dead for the murder of an Apache family in 1875. The article mentioned that he had shown no remorse, had cursed everyone involved until the hood was placed over his head. Naichi read those words and felt nothing. Not satisfaction, not relief, just a kind of quiet acknowledgement that justice, however imperfect, had been served. She showed the newspapers to Ezra, who read them carefully while his coffee grew cold. "It's over," he said finally. "Really over this time." Naichi placed a hand on her swollen belly. The baby kicked, as if in agreement. "Yes," she said. "Now we can truly move forward." That afternoon, Naichi was helping Rosa in the community garden when the first pain hit. It started low in her back, a tightening that made her breath catch. She straightened slowly, one hand going to her belly, and Rosa saw the expression on her face immediately. "How far apart?" Rosa asked calmly. "That was the first one," Naichi said. "Then we have time." Rosa helped Naichi to her feet. "But we should get you home, just in case." By the time they reached the cabin, the pains were coming every 20 minutes. Ezra took one look at Naichi's face and went pale. "Is it time? Is the baby coming?" "Babies come when they're ready," Grandmother Julia said. She had appeared seemingly from nowhere, moving with the efficiency of someone who had delivered dozens of children in her long life. "And this one seems ready." Dr. Chen arrived next, his medical bag already prepared because he had been expecting this for weeks. He examined Naichi with gentle competence and nodded. "First, babies take their time. We have hours yet. Rest between the pains. Save your strength."
The girls were sent to stay with neighbors, though Grace argued that she was old enough to help. Ezra held Naichi's hand through the early contractions, his face showing every bit of pain she felt.
After the 10th time he squeezed her hand so hard it hurt. Grandmother Julia gently suggested he might be more useful boiling water and preparing the cabin. The labor lasted through the afternoon and into the evening. Pain came in waves, each one stronger than the last, each one teaching Naichi something new about the limits of her endurance. She had survived a cage. She had survived slavery. She had survived Jacob Blackwood's whip and Cornelius Blackwood's system, and a journey through mountains that should have killed her. But this was different. This was not survival, but creation, not enduring, but bringing forth. Grandmother Julia stayed by her side, speaking in Apache, telling stories of other births, other women, other moments when new life pushed its way into the world against all odds. Dr. Chen monitored the baby's heartbeat with his stethoscope, nodding with satisfaction at what he heard.
And Ezra, despite being banished from the room during the hardest parts, could be heard pacing outside, his boots wearing a path in the wooden floor. As the sun set and the stars began to appear, the pains came faster, closer together, stronger. Naichi gripped Grandmother Julia's hands and pushed when told to push, breathed when told to breathe, surrendered to the process that was older than civilization and more powerful than any law men could write. And then, just as the evening star appeared in the western sky, her son was born. Dr. Chen caught him, this tiny, perfect human who had been waiting inside her for 9 months. The baby let out a cry that was all indignation and surprise at finding himself suddenly in a cold, bright world instead of the warm darkness he had known. Dr. Chen cleaned him quickly, checked him thoroughly, and smiled. "A boy," he announced, "healthy and strong." He placed the baby in Naichi's arms, and she looked down at her son for the first time.
He had stopped crying now, his eyes trying to focus on her face, his tiny hand gripping her finger with surprising strength. He had Ezra's dark hair already thick on his small head. He had her nose, or at least she thought he did. But mostly he looked like himself, like no one else who had ever existed, utterly unique and completely theirs. Ezra was allowed back in, and the expression on his face when he saw his son was one that Naichi would remember for the rest of her life. Pure joy mixed with wonder, mixed with a kind of awe that came from seeing a miracle made flesh. He sat carefully on the edge of the bed and reached out one rough finger to touch the baby's cheek. "He's perfect," Ezra whispered. "You're perfect." "What should we name him?" Naichi asked. They had discussed this, had considered names from both their cultures, had debated options for months, but now, looking at this tiny person who would carry whatever name they gave him for the rest of his life, the decision seemed both weighty and simple. "William," Naichi said, "for William Greyhawk, who died protecting children he never met." "And Bidzil," Ezra added, "the Apache name. He is strong." "William Bidzil Coleman," Naichi said, testing how it sounded. "Yes, that's his name." Grandmother Julia performed a blessing over the baby, welcoming him to the world in Apache, while Dr. Chen made notes in his medical journal about the birth. Outside, word had spread through Sanctuary Ridge that the baby had arrived, and people began gathering in the yard, waiting to welcome the newest member of their community. Over the next weeks, Naichi learned what it meant to be a mother from the very beginning. The sleepless nights when William cried for reasons she could not always decipher. The moments of pure terror when she was sure she was doing everything wrong. The overwhelming love that filled her chest so completely it was hard to breathe. The discovery that her body could feed this child, could provide everything he needed, was almost as miraculous as his birth had been. The 5 girls became devoted older sisters, each finding their own way to help. Grace held William with the confidence of someone who had helped raise her younger sisters. Pearl studied Dr. Chen's books on infant care with the same intensity she brought to learning medicine. Ruth drew pictures of the baby sleeping, his tiny features captured in charcoal. Clara read to him from books he could not possibly understand, but seemed to enjoy anyway. And Fawn simply sat beside Naichi whenever she nursed him, chattering away in her mix of English and Cherokee, making up songs about her new brother. Ezra was utterly besotted. This man who had lived hard in the mountains for years, who had survived loss and built a life from nothing, turned into someone completely different around his infant son. He held William for hours, just watching him sleep. He walked the floor with him at night when the baby was fussy, singing old songs in a voice that was surprisingly gentle. He built a cradle with his own hands, carving Apache symbols into the wood alongside Cherokee patterns, creating something that honored both parts of William's heritage. One evening, when William was about 3 months old, Naichi sat on the porch with her son at her breast, watching the sun set over the mountains. Ezra sat beside her, his arm around her shoulders, and for a moment everything was perfectly still, perfectly peaceful, perfectly right. "Do you remember," Naichi said quietly, "when you found me in that cage?" "Every detail," Ezra said. "Did you know then? Did you know it would lead to this?" Ezra was quiet for a moment. "No, I just knew I couldn't walk away. Everything else, all of this, it's more than I ever hoped for." Naichi looked down at William, who had fallen asleep nursing, his tiny mouth still moving slightly. "I was in that cage because I had nothing. No family, no home, no future. And now I have everything. How did that happen?" "You survived long enough to find us," Ezra said. "Or maybe we found you. Either way, we found each other." He pressed a kiss to her temple. "That's all that matters." The seasons turned. Summer came hot and bright, and William learned to smile, his whole face lighting up when he saw his parents or sisters. Fall brought cooler weather, and William learned to sit up, to grab at things, to babble sounds that were not quite words, but were trying to be. Winter came mild that year, and William took his first steps holding onto his father's hands, his face showing fierce concentration as he learned this new skill of moving through the world upright. By the time spring returned again, making William a year old, Sanctuary Ridge had continued to grow. More families had arrived, drawn by stories of a place where everyone was welcome. The settlement now had a proper school, a church that served multiple faiths, a trading post, and a council building where disputes were settled fairly. It was becoming something permanent, something that might last generations. Grace and Tall Pine announced their engagement, planning a wedding for the following summer. Pearl had successfully helped Dr. Chen save a man's life after a logging accident, cementing her path toward becoming a healer. Ruth's artwork had been commissioned by families as far away as Tucson. Clara had started teaching the younger children to read, and Fawn moved through the world with the confidence of a child who had never known anything but love and acceptance. On William's first birthday, the community gathered to celebrate. There was a feast, music, the kind of joyful chaos that comes when people who have found safety together choose to mark their blessings. Naiche watched her son smash his first piece of cake into his face with both hands, watched her daughters laugh and play with other children, watched her husband stand with the men of Sanctuary Ridge, like he had always belonged there. Grandmother Julia found her during the celebration, settling beside her with the careful movements of someone whose body was finally admitting its age. "You have built something beautiful," the old woman said in Apache. "We all built it together," Nietzsche replied. "Yes," Julia agreed, "but you were the spark. You came here broken and chose to heal. You came here afraid and chose to be brave. You showed everyone else that it was possible." She looked out at the gathered community. "Never forget what you survived to get here. But also, never let it define you. You are more than what was done to you." Nietzsche thought about that, about the cage in Copper Springs, and the years with Blackwood, and everything that had tried to destroy her. Those things had happened. They were part of her story. But they were not the whole story. Not anymore. That night, after the celebration had ended and William was asleep in his cradle and the girls were in their beds, Nietzsche stood at the window of the sleeping loft and looked out over Sanctuary Ridge. Lights glowed in windows. Smoke rose from chimneys. The settlement breathed in the darkness, alive and growing and becoming. Ezra came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist. "What are you thinking about?" "Everything," Nietzsche said. "And nothing." She leaned back against him. "I was thinking about how I used to be property, how I was locked in a cage and treated like an animal, how I thought I would die there." "But you didn't," Ezra said. "No, because you stopped. Because you saw me as human. Because your daughters saw me as a mother." She turned in his arms to face him. "You gave me more than freedom. You gave me a home. You gave me a family. You gave me a future I never thought I could have." "You gave me the same things," Ezra said. "I was half dead inside when I found you, going through the motions, raising my daughters but not really living. You brought me back." "We brought each other back," Nietzsche said. They stood together in the window, looking out at the life they had built from the ashes of their old lives. In the cradle behind them, William made a small sound in his sleep, already dreaming whatever dreams a 1-year-old child dreams. Downstairs, the house was full of the presence of 5 daughters who had chosen Nietzsche as their mother, and whom she had chosen right back. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. There would be hard days ahead, moments when the past came roaring back, times when Nietzsche would need to remember how to breathe through the memories. Healing was not linear. It did not happen all at once, but it was happening. One day at a time, one choice at a time, one moment of choosing hope over despair. The mountains stood eternal around Sanctuary Ridge, ancient and strong and unchanging. But the people who lived in their shadow changed constantly, grew constantly, became more than they had been. Nietzsche had come to these mountains as a woman with nothing, worth less than the price of fence posts and feed in the eyes of the world that had tried to break her. Now she stood in a home she had helped build, surrounded by a family she had chosen and who had chosen her, looking out at a future that stretched bright and wide before her. She had been property. She had been a prisoner. She had been less than human in the eyes of those who had power over her. But she had survived. And in surviving, she had become something those men with their cages and contracts could never understand. She had become free. Not just legally free, though that mattered, but free in her soul, in her spirit, in the deepest parts of herself that no one could cage or buy or break, no matter how hard they tried. "They say the mountains never change," Nietzsche whispered.
But people do. We came here broken. We found healing, not because the mountains changed us, but because we found each other. Ezra pulled her closer, and we'll keep finding each other, every day, for as long as we both live. In the distance, an eagle called, its cry echoing across the valley. Apache symbol of freedom, soaring high above the world, where cages and chains could never reach. Nietzsche watched it fly across the face of the moon and thought about her grandfather, about all the people she had lost, about William Greyhawk, who had died so that children could be safe. They would have been proud, she thought. Proud that she had survived. Proud that she had built something good from the ruins of what had been taken from her. Proud that she had chosen love over hate, mercy over vengeance, hope over despair. The eagle disappeared into the darkness, but its cry lingered in the air like a blessing, like a promise, like a reminder that no matter how hard the world tried to cage you, the human spirit could still find a way to fly. Nietzsche turned away from the window and toward the life waiting for her in this cabin, in this settlement, in this future she had earned with every breath, every step, every choice to keep going when stopping would have been easier. She had been locked in a cage and left to die. But a mountain man with 5 daughters and a heart big enough to see her humanity had broken the lock and given her freedom. And together, they had turned that freedom into something even more valuable. A home, a family, a life worth living, a legacy worth leaving. That was the real promise of the mountains. Not that they would protect you or save you or make everything easy, but that if you were strong enough, brave enough, stubborn enough to survive, they would give you the space and time to become who you were always meant to be. Nietzsche Coleman, formerly Nietzsche of the Chiricahua Apache, formerly property, formerly prisoner, formerly the woman in the cage, climbed into bed beside her husband. Tomorrow she would wake up and be a mother to 6 children. She would teach Apache language classes and help in the community garden and live her life as a free woman in a free community. But tonight, she simply closed her eyes and slept. And for the first time in longer than she could remember, she slept without nightmares. She slept without fear. She slept as a woman who knew, bone deep and certain, that she was finally, truly, completely home. And that was worth everything she had survived to get there.